Winter in the northern marches forgives no one who carries too much. When the orc female collapsed in the frozen mud, with her cub clinging to her furs, the mercenaries laughed. But a man who had shed too much blood on that land came down the hill. He owed nothing, except the old law of the honor trade. The wind cut like an iron blade through the fringes of Thornwood Forest. On that late afternoon in the bitter winter of 1887, the dirt road leading to Marrick village was a blur of snow and grey mud. The cold there killed anyone unprepared, freezing breath before it even touched the ground. The sky hung low and pale, the colour of old ash, and the pines groaned under the weight of ice on their branches. Through the frozen trail, two figures pushed forward, their bodies bent against the storm rolling down from the iron peaks, shoulders hunched, feet dragging furrows in the slush. One was small, stumbling every few steps. The other carried a heavy sack on her back, her boots punching through the thin crust of ice with each step. Zuna was not yet 30 winters old, though that afternoon she looked older. Her dark green skin had gone pale at the edges from the cold, and her black hair clung flat to her wet cheeks. She was an orc of the Northern Marches clans, tall and broad-shouldered under better conditions, but the weight of the grain sack and the frozen road had worn her down to something fragile and quiet. Beside her walked her cub, Zek, 5 winters old, barely reaching her hip. He wore a thin curtain of rough leather that had never been warm enough, and his boots were patched at the toe with a strip of rawhide. He said nothing. He watched his mother's feet and matched her steps, because silence on hard roads was something she had taught him early. Zuna's left ankle had been swelling since morning, and the swelling had crept up into the knee joint by afternoon, both bound together by the same bad step she had taken on a hidden route 2 miles back. She could feel the skin pressing tight against the leather of her boot, and every step sent a dull pulse of pain up her calf and into her leg. She said nothing. There was no one to tell. The trees thinned ahead, and through the curtain of falling snow she could see a stone and timber cabin sitting low against a hillside. Smoke climbed from its chimney in a thin white thread. A woodpile, a broken fence, a forge with its fire long out, the kind of place that said, "A man lives here alone and does not invite trouble." She had not planned to stop. She had not planned anything beyond reaching the next ridge before dark. Zek felt it before she did, the way the tremor in her hands spread to her arms. He stopped walking and looked up at her. She gave him a weak smile, the kind that said, "I am fine," without any truth behind it. He did not believe it. He never did. From inside the cabin, through a fogged pane of thick glass, a broad-shouldered man cleaned a worn saddle by firelight. He had the look of someone the frontier had used and put back on the shelf, weathered, scarred, slow in no way that mattered. His beard was dark and unkempt, and a small axe hung from the leather belt across the back of his chair. He did not notice the 2 figures outside, not yet. But somewhere on the wooden shelf behind him, in the corner he never looked at if he could help it, a small, carved wolf caught the firelight. And in the deep pocket of shadow beside it, a pair of small leather boots sat clean and still. The man had not touched them in 2 winters. Outside, the snow kept falling. Zuna's left knee buckled without warning. She did not cry out. There was a quiet crack from inside the joint, a rush of cold through her whole leg, and then the ground came up fast. She twisted as she fell, trying to keep the grain sack from tearing, but the linen split at the seam and the contents scattered into the snow. Dried grain, a handful of bone beads, a folded cloth she had carried since her compound was taken. She lay against the fence posts at the foot of the cabin steps. Her fingers closed around one of the wooden posts and she pulled, but her leg would not hold. The cold soaked through her furs in seconds. Zek stood over her. His lips were pressed tight. He had the look of a child who had learned that panic was a luxury. He looked at the cabin door. He walked up the 3 stone steps and knocked 3 times with his small fist. The door opened with a long, low groan of wood. Warmth came out in a wave. Wood smoke, tallow, and the dense smell of a stew long on the fire. The man filling the doorframe looked down at the orc child without expression. He was larger than he had seemed through the glass. "My mama can't walk anymore," the boy said, in the border tongue they both knew. The man's eyes moved past him to the figure lying against the fence. He stepped out without asking anything else. He crossed the snow in 4 strides, crouched down in front of Zuna and studied the way she was holding her leg. "Ankle or knee?" he said. "Both," she said. "It will pass. It won't pass in the cold." He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back and lifted her. She was heavier than she looked, the grain sack still partly in her arms, and the effort showed in his jaw and neck. But he stood upright and carried her up the steps without stopping to find his footing. Inside, he set her in the heavy oak chair closest to the hearth and did not say anything about the mud she brought in with her. He brought a tin cup of warm water to Zek and set it on the low stool near the boy's knees. He brought another to Zuna without asking if she wanted it. The fire popped and sent a spray of orange sparks up the chimney. Zuna looked around the cabin while her hands stopped shaking. Tools on the shelves, furs on the walls, a narrow bed neatly made, a half-built chair frame near the window, the kind of order that comes not from tidiness but from habit. A man who had learned to keep his space controlled because too many things outside it were not. Her eyes stopped briefly on the corner shelf, the carved wolf, the small boots. She did not ask. Estevan knelt and began to work the lacing of her boot loose, with careful, unhurried fingers, his broad hands moving slowly enough not to startle her. When the leather finally came away, the bruising ran from her ankle up toward the knee, a single chain of damage from that one bad step on the road. "How far did you walk on this?" he asked. "Since the Tescan crossing," she said. He looked at it a moment longer, then stood and went to find his herb tin. He worked in silence, and she let him. Estevan had a small stone mortar on the shelf between 2 chisels and a jar of rendered fat. He ground sage leaves and pine resin together until the paste went dark and wet, then spooned it onto a strip of coarse linen and pressed it gently against the bruised joint. He wrapped it firm but not tight, the way a man wraps something he wants to hold rather than crush. Zek had moved from the low stool to the sheep fleece rug beside the hearth. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest, watching Estevan work with the focused attention of a child learning something important. "Does that hurt?" Estevan asked, tying off the bandage. "Less than before," Zuna said. He nodded and went to check the stew. It was a dense thing, dried venison and turnip root, and a dark stock that smelled of old pepper and earth. He ladled 2 portions into tin bowls and set them on the table. A third, smaller bowl, he placed on the rug near Zek without ceremony. The boy looked at it, then at Estevan, then at his mother. "It's yours," Estevan said. They ate. Near the end of the meal, Estevan noticed the tear in Zek's shoulder seam, a long split in the leather coat, poorly hemmed with what looked like fishing twine. He said nothing then, but after the bowls were cleared, he went to the corner shelf and opened a flat bone box. Inside, a thick bone needle, a coil of deer sinew thread, and 2 patches of treated hide. He called the boy over with a tilt of his chin. Zek came and stood still while Estevan turned the coat at the shoulder and began to stitch. The needle moved with the same deliberate care as his hands on her ankle. Slow, precise, worth trusting. "Nobody fixed my skin since my father went down in the mines," Zek said quietly, watching the needle travel through the hide. Estevan's hand stopped for 1 beat, then he kept sewing. When he finished, he set the coat back on the boy's shoulders and ran his palm roughly over the top of Zek's head, messing the coarse dark hair. He said nothing. He did not need to. Zuna watched from the chair. She had been watching since the first bowl of stew. She was trying to find the angle, what a man alone in a frontier cabin wanted from a wounded orc woman and her cub. She had enough experience with the Iron Peaks to know that nothing came free in the marches. But the fire was warm, and her knee hurt less, and Zek had eaten until he looked sleepy. So she set the thought down for now, and let the warmth work on her. She almost missed it, a flicker in the corner of the room near the shelf where the small boots sat. Not firelight. Something low and quick, a shape that pressed briefly against the shadows and then dissolved, like breath on cold glass. The carved wolf on the shelf caught the light at a different angle for just a moment, as if something had passed between it and the fire. She blinked. It was gone. She told herself it was the fire shifting, but her clan's shamans had a word for that kind of movement. Grutek, the passing of an unfinished spirit. She had not thought about that word in years. She did not sleep easily that night. Morning came slowly to the northern marches. The pale light that filtered through the frosted glass was the color of old ivory, weak and flat, barely enough to read by. The storm had passed, leaving a deep silence outside, broken only by the slow drip of ice melt from the cabin roof. Zuna woke under a second blanket she had not been given the night before. The fire had been banked and was still alive, the coals glowing orange in the stone mouth of the hearth. Zek slept on the rug nearby, curled under a strip of bison hide, his breathing the slow rhythm of a child, with nothing pressing on him for the first time in weeks. Estevan was already at the table, pulling the edge of his hunting axe along a whetstone in long, even strokes. The sound was rhythmic and calm, like a clock that didn't measure hours. Zuna pushed herself to sitting. Her knee protested. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Get up yet, or sit still?" he asked. "Move us along," she said. "We've been a burden long enough in your house." He drew the axe once more across the stone. "You're not a burden in my house." She watched him for a moment. There was no performance in it. He said it the way he said everything. Flat, without extra weight, like a man who didn't see the point of lying about small things. "Why?" she asked. He stopped sharpening. He set the axe on the table and turned it once with his thumb, studying the edge. "My boy was 6 when the winter of '84 came in hard. By spring, there were just the tools and the chair." He paused. "The chair was too big for me to burn." Zuna said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. They sat in the quiet of that shared wait for a while, and neither one pretended it was comfortable, because it wasn't, but it was honest. And in the northern marches that counted for more. Later, while Zek gnawed on a strip of dried venison near the window and watched the snow-covered tree line with the watchful calm of a child raised on frontier roads, Zuna told her own story. She did not perform it. She released it the way you put down a load you've been carrying since before you remember picking it up. Her companion had died in a mine collapse in the Iron Peaks 3 months past. A support beam had gone, and 23 men, orc and human both, had gone with it. The company foreman, a man called Vaga, had filed the collapse as an equipment failure and closed the claim before the families could press charges. 3 weeks later, soldiers had arrived at her door with a paper she had not signed. She had walked north because there was nothing left behind her. Estevan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet a long time. Then he said, "What's in the sack you were carrying?" She looked at him. "A contract," she said. "Original deed of clan land in West March. Vaga forged a replacement to clear title for the mines. I have the real one." The whetstone sat still on the table. "Where were you taking it?" he asked. "The elders at West March Council," she said, "before the freeze cut the pass." By midday, a rider came. Zuna heard the hooves before Estevan did. Orc hearing ran sharper on the low frequencies of iron shoes on frozen ground. She said nothing, but her hand went to Zek's shoulder and pressed once, the signal they had between them, that meant still and quiet. The rider was a lean man named Morris, with a grey beard and tobacco-stained teeth, and the look of someone who knew everyone's business in a 50-mile radius without being asked. He hauled 2 sacks from his saddle, provisions Estevan had traded for, and dropped them in the snow near the door. Then he saw Zuna in the doorway. He spat into the snow and pulled Estevan aside by the sleeve. "You've got trouble coming," Morris said, low. "Word crossed the Tescan this morning. Vaga's put 10 silver on the heads of a green female and a cub. Says they stole company property. He looked at the door, guessing that's them. Estevan took the sacks from the snow without answering. 10 silvers more than a man earns in 2 months here, Morris added. I know what 10 silver is, Estevan said. Morris looked at him for a moment, then shrugged and climbed back into the saddle. He was a man who shared information as currency and spent nothing extra on argument. When the hooves faded back into the tree line, Estevan came inside and set the provisions on the table. He looked at Zuna. Why would a company foreman put silver on your head? He said. She met his eyes without flinching. Because I have proof of what he did. He nodded slowly. The arithmetic was simple. A forged deed, a dead mine. A woman with the original contract walking toward the elders who could undo everything Vaga had built. Simple enough that it didn't require explanation, only a decision. Zek had come to stand beside Estevan. The boy put his small fingers around the leather cuff of the man's sleeve and held on without speaking, watching his mother's face the way children watch the sky before a storm. Estevan looked down at him. Nobody's going to put a hand on you in this house, he said. Either of you. The fire shifted in the hearth. Outside, a single crow crossed the grey sky over the tree line and banked once, not the clean crossing of a bird with somewhere to go, but the slow turn of something keeping watch. Zuna tracked it with her eyes until it settled in the highest pine at the edge of the clearing and sat there, still, facing the cabin. Her clan's shamans said that crows carrying the weight of the unfinished would find the place where the debt lived and wait. She thought of the flicker near the shelf 2 nights ago. She thought of the small boots. She did not say any of this to Estevan, but she understood now that the spirit she had glimpsed was not a threat. It was anchored here, close to a man who had not yet been able to let it go. And it was waiting, the way the unfinished always waited, for the moment the living finally allowed themselves to move forward. That evening, Estevan worked at the bench by the window. He was making a crutch, ash wood smoothed at the arm and fitted with a pad of wrapped deer hide at the top. He worked the way he did everything, without wasted motion, without talking about what he was doing, just doing it. The plane moved in long strokes and the shavings curled to the floor. Zuna watched from the chair. "You're making that for me," she said. "You can't walk on that knee properly yet." "I've been walking on worse." "I know," he said. "That's why it looks like that." She was quiet a moment. "Why do you live this far out?" He blew a curl of shaving off the wood. "Because the closer you get to Marek, the more people want things from you that aren't yours to give." She understood that. The clan territories had worked the same way before the company foremen arrived with their papers and their promises of wages. "What did you give up to come here?" she asked. He set the plane down. He turned the crutch in his hands, checked the grain. "A life that didn't fit anymore," he said. "After my boy, nothing in Marek held any shape. So I came here and built something that did." He paused. "It's a quiet kind of life, but a lonely one," she said. He picked the plane back up. "Most honest things are." Zek had fallen asleep on the rug again, his breathing deep and even, one small fist tucked under his chin. In sleep he looked even younger. 5 winters was very young to carry the weight he carried. Estevan glanced at him and then looked away quickly, the way a man looks away from something that is too close to something else. The crutch was finished before the fire burned low. He handed it to her without ceremony, and she tested her weight against it. It fit. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me for wood," he said. Later, when he had banked the fire and the cabin was dim and warm, Zuna lay on the pallet he had given her and stared at the ceiling. Through the one small gap in the shutters, she could see a strip of night sky, black and hard and salted with stars. She thought about the contract folded in her sack. She thought about Vaga's name scratched onto a replacement deed in someone else's hand. She thought about 23 men under the earth in the Iron Peaks. And she thought about the way Estevan had looked at her son's coat when he saw the torn seam. Before he said a word, the way a man looks at something that he already intends to fix. Sleep came slow, but it came. 3 riders came at first light. Zuna heard them when they were still at the edge of the tree line. The particular rhythm of horses pushed too hard on icy ground, the creak of loaded leather. She was already sitting up on the pallet when Estevan came out of his corner with the flintlock rifle in his hand, his boots already on. He had heard them too. Zek woke at the sound of the rifle being primed and looked at his mother. She shook her head once. Stay. Through the frosted window, 3 shapes resolved out of the tree line into the grey early light. The one in the centre sat his horse, with the particular ease of a man who was used to being the largest threat in a given space. He wore a bear fur coat over iron-plated shoulders, and had the kind of face that had never learned doubt. Captain Vaga. Beside him, 2 mercenaries with iron hatchets at their belts and expressions like dogs who had been rewarded for biting. Estevan stepped out onto the stone steps. The cold hit him flat and hard. He let it. Vagar reined his horse in the clearing and looked at the man on the steps with the calculation of someone doing quick math on the cost of different outcomes. The rifle was already leveled. "You're Estevan the carpenter," Vagar said, his voice rolling across the snow like something unhurried, "a long way from your market stall." "You rode a long way for nothing," Estevan said. "Hand over the female and the cub," Vagar said. "The company will pay what it offered. No grief to you. You weren't part of this." Behind Estevan, the door opened. Zuna came out on the crutch and stood at his shoulder, upright, her chin level. The rawness on her cheeks from days of cold wind had faded to a pale weathering that made her look harder than when she had arrived. She looked at Vaga with eyes that had been deciding to be done with running since before she reached the cabin. "You never owned our blood, Vaga," she said. Her voice did not shake. The captain smiled at one corner of his mouth. "Just the land under your feet and the iron in the hill. Forged deeds," she said. "I have the real one." The smile stopped. One of the mercenaries moved his hand toward his hatchet. Estevan watched the hand. The flintlock's crack split the morning. The sound rolled across the snow-covered clearing and bounced off the tree line and came back diminished, the way all violence diminishes when it hits empty air. It was one shot, measured, placed in Vaga's right shoulder, before the captain's hand reached his sword hilt. Vaga came off his horse. He landed in the black mud and snow, his bear fur coat splayed, the sword still in its scabbard. He made a sound that was not quite a word, and pressed his gloved hand to the wound, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has spent years being the one who decides, and has just had that taken away. The 2 mercenaries looked at each other. They looked at the man on the steps, who had set the rifle aside and stood with the axe loose in his right hand, held low and unhurried, the blade turned slightly outward, the way a man holds a tool he knows how to use. There was no performance in the stance. That was what made it effective. They spurred their horses and went back into the trees. Estevan descended the steps. He stood over Vaga in the snow and looked at the man in the mud and the blood and the expensive coat, and he felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. He had felt the same way at the end of other moments like this, in other years, in other frontier places, where men like Vaga built small kingdoms out of other people's losses. There was never satisfaction, only the quiet that came after a long sound. "The contract goes to the West March Elders," Estevan said. "You're going to ride back to your company and explain what a foreman's rifle-shot shoulder means when it turns up at an inquiry. And if I hear your name again in the marches, I will not aim for the shoulder." Vaga said nothing. He found his horse and pulled himself up with one arm and rode slowly back through the tree line, and was gone. The clearing was very still. Zuna came down from the steps on the crutch, slow and careful. She stood beside him, and they both looked at the place in the snow where the mud and blood had left a mark. Then the wind moved, and the snow started coming down again, soft and even, and the mark began to fill. Estevan tucked the axe back into his belt. A few seconds passed. Then, from inside the cabin, the door burst open, and Zek ran out into the snow in his socks, throwing both arms around Estevan's legs and holding on with the grip of someone who had been waiting for permission to be afraid. Estevan looked down at him. The boy's face was pressed into the leather of his coat, and his shoulders were shaking, not with cold, but with the release of something that had been held too tight for too long. Estevan crouched down until he was at the boy's level. He put one large hand on the back of Zek's head. "It's done," he said quietly. "Nobody's coming back." The boy looked up at him. His eyes were wet. "Pa," he whispered. Barely a sound, more breath than word. Estevan did not correct him. He pulled the boy against his chest and held him there in the snow while the flakes came down around them, and Zuna stood a step away with one hand over her mouth, watching the two of them as if something that had been broken for a very long time had just quietly set itself right. The thaw came in pieces. First the drip from the cabin roof in the afternoon hours, then the sound of the Tescan running freely again, somewhere through the pines. Then the morning Zuna walked to the cabin door and back without the crutch, testing the knee slowly, the way you test ice, one careful step at a time. 3 weeks had passed since Vaga rode out of the clearing. Morris had come by twice, the second time he brought news. The West March elders had received a rider carrying copies of the forged deed, alongside a written account. An inquiry was already opened. The company foreman had not been seen at his office in Marek since the week of the thaw. Morris reported this with the flat tone of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the endings of stories he had helped along. The contract was out of Zuna's hands, and she had found, unexpectedly, that this did not leave her empty. It left her quiet. There was a difference. On the morning the ice broke from the eaves in long, clear sheets, Estevan came in from the woodpile and found Zek sitting at the workbench with a scrap of pine and one of the smaller carving knives, working at something with the focused squint of a child attempting a thing for the first time. He was making a wolf, or trying to. It did not look much like one yet. Estevan sat down across from him and turned the wood in the boy's hands slightly, adjusting the angle without taking it away. They worked like that for a while in the thin winter light. At one point Zek looked up and said, without particular weight, "Is the bad man coming back?" "No," Estevan said. The boy nodded and returned to his carving. That was enough for him. Later, on the steps, Zuna sat with her boot off and her face turned toward the pale sun. Estevan came and stood beside her and held out his hand. In his palm was a small ring of old hammered silver, worn smooth, the kind of object that had a history before it became what it was now. "You could stay," he said, not as a question. She looked at the ring for a moment. She thought of the flicker near the shelf on that first night, the Grutek, the unfinished spirit her shamans had named. She looked at the corner shelf through the open cabin door. The carved wolf sat there in the light, same as always. But something about it felt different now, lighter, as if whatever had been anchored to this place had finally found what it was waiting for and let go. She closed her fingers around the ring. "I know," she said. Inside, Zek had set the unfinished wolf beside the carved one on the shelf. The two wolves, one smooth from years of being held, one rough and new, sat together in the pale light from the window. He studied them for a moment, then went back to the bench satisfied, as if something had been decided. Outside, the pines dripped steadily. The Tescan ran in the distance. The clearing where 3 horses had stood in the snow and mud was already grown over with new white. The land doing what land does, patient and indifferent, covering the evidence of small human violences and moving on. Zuna slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit, not perfectly, but close enough that it would, in time.